Hi, my name is Dr. Ann. Today I'm going to be talking to you about cognitive load theory and about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So this is all, I'm no expert on this topic. This is all very new to me, and so I'm taking my materials from a book by Richard Mayer entitled The Multimedia Learning. And so I refer you to this text if you have questions after the information that I give you. So I'm doing the best that I can to teach you something that's very new to me. So cognitive load theory was developed by Sweller in 1994, and it refers to how much effort the human brain uses to transfer information from working, now notice I say working and not short term, from working memory to long-term memory. And they define learning as the shift of this information from the working memory to the long-term memory in terms of transference. So it's not about behavior, but it's about that actual process of moving the information from the working memory over to the long-term memory. And in that thinking, or in that mindset, the cognitive or the working memory has a finite capacity. And so that gives rise to this idea of something called cerebral architecture. And so what the cognitive load theory says is that there's two categories for in the brain for knowledge to be processed. One is called biological primary and the other is called biological secondary. And we're going to be focusing on biological secondary discussion today. But biological primary information, I always think of it as kind of like the genetic code of the brain. It's where material is already there. It can't be relearned. It's nothing that where learning can take place. It's just the way that it is. That information is already pre-programmed. That the biological secondary can be altered. That's really where learning can take place, and it's deliberate. And so we explicitly and deliberately work to change that through our teaching. So within that secondary category, within the biological secondary category, there are subcategories. One is considered intrinsic, the other is defined as extrinsic, and the last called germane. And I'll talk more about those. But in terms of cerebral architecture, in addition to the primary, secondary biological categories and the intrinsic, external, and germane categories, there are these things called schemas. And the schemas are really just the schemas are where the transmission of let's see, I'll just read it. The neuronal transmittal connective pathways supporting an infinite number of possibilities. So it's the neuronal activity that moves from the working to the long-term memory. All right. An interesting point about the human brain with these storage compartments and pathways is that only when information is coming in, it can only process 5 to 9 units of information at a time. I find that fascinating. So when we talk about that, we talk about an average of 7. Units of information can be processed at any one point in time. And remember, so it's coming in through the secondary pathway into the working memory, and it's going to be categorized into intrinsic, extrinsic, or germane, and then moved neurologically transmitted, neuronally transmitted to the long-term memory. Fascinating. And that is when learning takes place, and that's foundational for behavioral changes. Okay, so the intrinsic load. Remember, it's the amount of effort that is being used to move from the working memory over to the long-term memory. So this load, that means, and the finite capacity, if you think about it like pressure, each one of those categories has to have a certain amount of load to it for the transmission to take place. But it also means that if there's a finite number, too much will just make the whole thing shut down. So if you think about the brain as a factory as opposed to a muscle at this point in time, what it means is that if you don't keep the pressure stabilized in each of those categories, then the whole factory is going to shut down. So as instructors, we have to keep the pressure stabilized in those categories. So the intrinsic load we cannot alter, but it's still necessary for long-term memory building. Now we'll talk about that. Extraneous loads are those things that are just plain irrelevant to learning. And if it gets too high, it causes shutdown. And if it's not the proper information, it can really impact what's stored in the long-term memory. So it's got to be accurate information. And then the germane load is relevant to the schema production. So that's really where learning is supported and the contribution to learning is made in the germane. Okay, so if you think about this, and the germane too, I always think about it like the four corners of a puzzle. You really can't see or put the pieces together without having those four corners in place. So if you think about this puzzle-like design, 5 principles keep it sound, okay? And the first principle is called the information store principle. And it maintains that the primary aim of instruction is to appropriately alter the long-term memory storage of new information. So, I mean, that's pretty self-evident, that definition. So the next thing that we need to realize is that borrowing and reorganizing principle. And it asserts that humans acquire information from other people and contribute that information to their learning. So in essence, by listening to me explain to you the information of long-term memory and learning through cognitive load theory, you're better able to understand the principles and the whole theory in and of itself. If you read the book, that's fine, but if you listen to somebody tell you about it, you can borrow that information as it's being told, and it enhances your learning potential. Okay, and then the third theory is called randomness of genesis principle. And it explains that for information to be transferred into the long-term memory, it is to be stored in the working memory and processed into novel information. So there's a little bit of a filtering thing that goes on according to this principle. Then the narrowing limits of change principle just indicates that the brain works to reduce the amount of information into functional chunks. And again, we talked about an average of 7 units of information that can be processed at any one point in time so that it can be converted into meaningful long-term information. And then the environmental organizing and linking principle claims that information in the external environment must be reconciled with information to validate that it's appropriate for storing and for one to take action with. And you know, I always think of this kind of like, if you believe that the reason that humans have to learn is to survive, and some people believe that that's why we take information in, is to protect our essence. And so if you think of it kind of like a cat or a dog, a puppy or a kitten leaving its den. They have learned to walk, and then they kind of tiptoe out of that den after they see mom going in and out. And they tiptoe in and they look around and say, is it okay? Am I safe? Oh, I don't see mom. I run back in the den. And it's this tiptoeing in and out. And I think of the environmental organizing linking principle in just that way. You have to kind of leave your long-term memory before you believe or that you know that it's safe. And that can protect it. If safety is threatened, and I see that as inaccurate information, then I'm not going to store that as valid. And that's all that it really says. So now we can talk about cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And I will refer to it as CTML. And it was developed by Mayer and his research team in 1996. Cognitive load theory by Sweller in 1994. And these guys came up with CTML in 1996. The CTML basically proposes that learning takes place through graphics and text. And they came up with one principle called the multimedia principle, which proposes that, no, it doesn't propose, it claims that learning is deeper and more meaningful when words and pictures are used in combination than words alone. So it's more helpful that you not only hear what I'm saying, but can see some graphics to support what I'm saying. So much so that when they tested this, they found a 1.5 effect size. And what that means is that that's really strong. And how we use that, the measurement for strength in research in terms of effect size is 0.5, low effect. Above 0.5, high effect, a more stronger effect. So 1.5 is an extremely strong effect size. CTML proposes three conditions. It's audio and visual pathway, or a dual channel pathway to process new information. So now we have sensory input, and both of those channels, here's the second condition, both of those channels can take up to 7 units of information that are processed at about 20 seconds each. So we have this rapid intake of information, and then the third condition is that that information is processed for learning to take place, so it's in the working memory, that it's processed through, filtering, selecting, organizing, and integrating. So all that has to take place in the working memory for learning to take place. Now, compared to cognitive load theory, CTML also uses the 3 categories, but Mayer redefined those categories or relabeled those categories. And those categories are, let's see, make sure I get this right, extraneous, essential, and generative. And they're all considered processing categories. So they're analogous to the intrinsic, extrinsic, and germane categories, but they are entitled extraneous processing, essential processing, and generative processing. Mayer also says that these are additive. So instead of just one category causing the pressure and shutdown, each of these can add up together to cause shutdown or transference of information. So again, when we're teaching, it's our job to make certain that we control what's happening within that working memory. Mayer presented 15 secondary principles for multimedia learning, and that are all aimed at instructional goals to reduce the additive effect. And here's how we do it. We minimize extraneous data, we manage essential processing, and we foster generative processing. And we do that in one of two approaches, through technology-centered approaches or learner-centered approaches. That's all I've got to tell you today.